As was already said, I'm Chris. I'm the Executive Director of the Phoenix Conservancy, and I really appreciate that introduction, Jody. It's good to be here, and I'm very, very excited to be presenting for everybody. So we're going to, I'm going to start out by giving kind of a basic overview of the Phoenix Conservancy, because I understand that this may be our first introduction to you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization as a whole, including some of our fun stuff that we're doing on the Palouse and around with our other project sites. And then I'll hand things over to Sarah and Alison, who will then talk about some of the more Palouse-centered stuff. And I will shift from presenter to slideshow manager. So with that, I'm going to talk a bit today about some of the new approaches to Palouse Prairie outreach and restoration that we've done last year and are planning to do this year, including this fine creature sitting in front of us right here. Hopefully, at least some of the folks in the audience got a chance to interact with the goats, which we used for invasive species control, including whitetop here at Conservation Park. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more about who and what the Phoenix Conservancy is, starting with a very, 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 very brief history, which is that we were founded in Pullman in 2016. Our mission is to restore endangered ecosystems globally for the communities that depend on them and the conservation of biodiversity. And I've highlighted a handful of these words just to talk about a little bit more about our perspective and to also kind of introduce the Phoenix Conservancy through some of the more common questions that we get. Oh, starting with this one. No, we're not in Arizona yet. So the Phoenix is actually a very carefully chosen symbol for restoration. And again, modeled after the bird of fire, not the fiery city in Arizona, where a lot of people assume we're from. The symbolism there being, in a lot of cases, our ecosystems are quite literally rising from ashes as we work to restore them. Well, that's interesting, rotation. Which brings me to restoration. So one of the more common questions we get is restoration to what? To when? And it's a really good question because the world obviously is always changing. So you could easily make a case to say, well, if you really cared about restoration far enough back, you'd be trying to get these woolly mammoths and horses and everything that was here in the last ice age. And then if you really want to go completely off the rails with that, no, we're not restoring, obviously, the rainforests and jungles and things that have existed in the Pullman area for various periods of time. A more functional definition of how we see restoration is returning an ecosystem to its healthy functional state with the maximum extant native biodiversity and minimal extinction rates. There's a lot of ways to define restoration. We use it kind of as a shorthand, just because return to a healthy functional and so on doesn't really roll off the tongue. So we use restoration as a shorthand, not to go back in time, but to buy time for the organisms that are in this ecosystem and in the ecosystems that we work, time to adapt to what comes ahead. And so to use one of my favorite analogies, especially as a biologist, Alison, Wonderland comes up a lot, or Through the Looking Glass as well. And specifically the Red Queen, and the conversation that Alice has with the Red Queen, in which the Red Queen says to Alice that she must run as fast as she possibly can to stay exactly where she is. And we use it in biology a lot to describe evolution, but in ecosystem restoration, all of the organisms that call these ecosystems home are doing the same thing and rushing to try to keep up with this rapidly changing world. And the real problem happens, and this is our project for Madagascar, when a really sudden abrupt change hits an ecosystem. So for example, a wildfire like the one that washed through just before that footage was taken in Madagascar. In circumstances where things change too quickly, it becomes very hard for these organisms and ecosystems to persist. So we really see ourselves as trying to buy as much time as we possibly can and restore a new balance. We do so on 3 scales that are nested within each other: locally, nationally, and globally. Our local project is right here in the Palouse Prairie, which is what we're going to primarily be talking about today. Our national project out in the Great Plains focuses on northern shortgrass prairie. And in a global context, we focus on rainforests of Madagascar in an area called Ivoire, which I'm very happy to say recently just got formal government protection. So it's the newest protected area in Madagascar. So how do we define these things? Because they seem very disparate at first glance. You've got two prairies and a rainforest. How do we get there? We have three central criteria that we use to define our flagship projects. Endangered in so much as they are less than 10% intact. Depending on estimates, it tends to be a little closer to 5% or less intact, I'm sorry to say, but that's what we really use to focus our efforts on the most endangered ecosystems where our work is needed the most. They're also defined by high biodiversity, and that can be in total species number, in uniqueness. So for example, in our rainforests that we work in Madagascar, there's quite a few species that don't exist anywhere but that forest. Or in composition like Palouse Prairie, where it's an unusual blend of lots of different species. And then finally, in recognizing that we did just found in 2016, we have to make sure that we are working in places where we have a pragmatic opportunity to make as much impact as humanly possible. And where those three spheres meet, we have one of our Phoenix sites. And the last word that I kind of highlighted is, and as part of our mission, is to restore ecosystems for the communities that depend on them. So that's not something that shows up as often with pure restoration. But our perspective is that one of the major tenets of successful long-term ecological restoration really hinges on economic restoration in the long term. Almost invariably, ecosystem degradation usually happens in the pursuit of humans trying to make a living in whatever way they can. And in order to realize the ecosystem services that are placed by that ecosystem, they're very large scale, but they're often very slow. And so if you're, for example, restoring a deep-rooted, long-lived, slow-growing prairie, it takes a while to really see those ecosystem services really come to fruition. And therefore, one of our tenets as a pragmatic restorer is that successful restoration really rests on being as inclusive as possible with the local communities, and has to have elements that improve the lives and livelihoods of these communities. And in doing so, creates economic opportunities that are tied to the restoration and to the healthy ecosystem itself, and therefore creating economic feedback into ongoing restoration. And a really good example of this is Madagascar, where what you can see here is one of the local community members in the vicinity of Ivoire is directly participating in the restoration of that rainforest by helping to build a fire break. And this gentleman is inspecting some of the baby trees that he helped plant about 5 months earlier during the construction of the first fire break. And what you can see also behind him is a large number of people working and being hired directly by this effort and creating jobs, making fire break and restoring rainforests. So we've hired, I think, about 6,000 people at this point. So created a lot of jobs directly tied to it. And a really good one that we're enacting here on the Palouse is using a vine, a native peppercorn that grows in the rainforest of Madagascar, as a fuel and an economic engine, directly funneling resources back to the people that grow these successful species and help restore this rainforest. And shout out to our friends over in Lodgepole, who have been just fantastic, and for a long time have been incorporating this really unique pepper called Boat Superfair. Hopefully some people in the audience have had a chance to experience it. It's fairly hard to describe, but very floral, just an amazing thing. And the coolest thing about it is it doesn't grow anywhere except in rainforest. So the more demand there is for this pepper, the more the demand there is directly for rainforest in Madagascar. So it creates this really cool feedback loop into restoration. And I won't talk too much about that because the focus is on Palouse Prairie, but there are some really cool opportunities that are similar in creating some interesting economic opportunities while offering ecosystem services right here on the Palouse. And a really good example of that is one of the newer and more novel approaches that Sarah's going to talk a bit about, which is our Pocket Prairie program here in the Palouse. This is, as you can see, part of an internal area within an apartment complex, is one of our major flagships, but this takes advantage of small and otherwise unused land areas within an urban landscape to start weaving restored prairie back into the daily lives and create these interconnected networks, while also creating jobs and ecosystem services. So on that note, I will step back and let Sarah take over. So Sarah.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. You can advance the slide. My slide master. Great. So yeah, I'll talk about our Pocket Prairie program. But before we get there, I just kind of want to set up for anyone who's not really familiar with the status of the prairie currently and kind of why we undertake the work here specifically, what the prairie is and why it is so ecologically important to our region. So kind of depending on your definition of like soil type or vegetation cover or climate, the Palouse is a region in general with pretty blurry boundaries, as you can see by this map. For our purposes today, when we talk about the Palouse Prairie and where we mostly focus in that kind of shaded region, which sometimes is called like the core Palouse area. But depending on those other factors, sometimes you can get a little bit of like a wider sense of the gradients of communities. So the Palouse, as we refer to it for our purposes here, is kind of that kind of classic undulating rolling hill topography that you can see in the top picture, which is basically the land that was not scoured away by the massive like Missoula floods. And it once hosted just like an incredible amount of floral diversity, like you can see in the picture on the bottom. Most folks who live in this region associate the term Palouse with agriculture, but for more time than not, it wasn't really the dominant vegetation. So the dominant vegetation was, really highly diverse mix of flowering plants. We call those forbs, bunch grasses, woody shrubs, scattered trees, depending on the specific kind of site conditions of the area. And, a lot of the land use changed in a very short amount of time. So when Chris was saying, we work in areas that are 10%, 5%, here in the Palouse, it's really less than 1% of intact habitat. And the stuff that we have is very scattered and very small. But a lot of that change happened in a short amount of time. So in the memories of many generations, you say Palouse, and you do really think of the rolling hills of wheat and agriculture, because that's what's in the lived memories of most people. But for a lot of time, it has been this really high floral diversity. You can change the slide. And so, kind of going along with that, it's important to acknowledge that people in prairies have been connected, since time immemorial. There are, a large number of Indigenous people who have been supported by and also supported this ecosystem. And I just really want to acknowledge that that kind of persistent cultural connection, going back since time immemorial and continuing on to today. There's a lot of different tribes and bands that have inhabited and passed through this region. And so the descendants of the first peoples of the Palouse are now a part of a lot of different contemporary tribal communities, including the Nez Perce tribe, whose land we're in here in the Pullman area. But there's also people who are part of the Coeur d'Alene tribe, the Kalispel tribe of Indians, the Spokane tribe of Indians, the Confederated tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation, and also the Confederated tribes of the Colville Reservation, who all kind of, have that deep cultural connection to this place that, we call the Palouse. And so today, a lot of the prairie looks like this. There are remnants that are surrounded largely by agriculture, and they're also highly invasible. And so you can see in this little prairie remnant picture towards the bottom, there's a lot of cheatgrass. So the parcels of prairie that we have that are still intact today are, kind of a lot of them in rough shape. And so, we really have only a couple of options for what we need to do to keep this ecosystem, persisting into the future. We can either, preserve and maintain what we have left, which is an essential part of the puzzle. But because so little is left, we also really consciously have to rebuild the prairie plant communities throughout our region. Next. And so we want to do that because these prairies are not only culturally important, but they're also incredibly ecologically important. They have really diverse amount of above ground habitat that is supportive of all sorts of different wildlife. But a lot of the magic of the prairie is kind of what is below ground. Next. And so when I look out at a prairie, I kind of think about it like an iceberg, because what you see on the top like totally pales in comparison to the amount of like biomass that is below the soil. And it's due to these like really deep root systems that we get a lot of the amazing ecological benefits from our prairie. So these roots, they anchor those really light soils that are highly erosible. They also kind of like pump sugar into the ground that takes care of soil microbes and fungi communities. They play really important roles in like nutrient and carbon cycles. And then that partnership between the plants and the soil ecosystem also enhances our soil texture, which in turn, when it rains, allows that water to percolate down, and we have good groundwater infiltration due to all of these things kind of being connected. And so, going along with that, plants are always taking carbon out of the air and using it to build their tissues. And when they do that, both, building their tissues above ground and below ground, and then also putting that sugar for all of their little like microbial friends in the ground, they're taking that carbon out of the air and putting it down in the ground for a very, very long time. And so studies have shown that in adjacent kind of tilled conventional agricultural lands and Palouse Prairie remnants, there is over twice the amount of long-term like stable carbon in the soil than in those tilled areas. But then studies have also shown that if you kind of like change those conventionally tilled agricultural places and put them in a different kind of plant cover, you can recover some of that soil carbon. So, that process isn't lost forever. If we change what we're putting on the ground and the way that we're interacting with it, we can, kind of take advantage of that that carbon sponge quality of these prairie ecosystems. And then also, just side note, if you're a total like nerd for like old timey studies and like awesome botanical pictures, you should check out this 1916 study by John Ernst Weaver, who is a botanist who studied flora of the Palouse region. And he dug these giant trenches and like excavated a bunch of different prairie plants. And there's a bunch of cool hand-drawn, like weather charts and plant assemblages, and you should check it out. It's a PDF you can download for free. And so for our purposes, urban pocket prairies are really like a piece of the Palouse puzzle that we can address immediately. So there, large scale restoration in this region is incredibly difficult. Like, we're not going to say that it is impossible, but it is very difficult because a majority of the land is privately owned, and a lot of that land is also used for growing crops, which are an important part of this area's economy. They're an important part of the global food chain. Like, it's unreasonable to expect that like millions, or not millions, but like, thousands of acres of cropland are going to be turned into prairie in the near future. There's a large project. The largest project is happening up at Eastern. That's in process, and that'll probably be about, north of 110 acres that are being restored. But there just really isn't as much available land to get, the benefits that we might want to see on a large scale. And so what we can do is work in these smaller places, like Chris mentioned, in underutilized lands, and try and, meet different goals that different landowners have. And then also, leverage those spaces to reclaim some of those ecological services, carbon sequestration, water infiltration, habitat building. And they also kind of help us, have like a tangible place where people can connect to that idea of there being prairie. And so our Pocket Prairie program, it's been ramping up in earnest for like the last 2 years. And we have now pocket prairies that are installed in public, private, and commercial properties. We're utilizing native plants from the Palouse region. We're working with landowners to tailor those plant assemblages to fit their sites and their goals. And for the most part, we're using the plants and seeds that are on like the commercial market right now. But we also acknowledge that to get the amount of floral and functional diversity that we want in these sites, we need to undertake a lot of kind of plant materials development to supplement the stuff that's already on the market with more diversity. So we're working on establishing, seed collection programs, doing experiments to figure out how to grow some of the stuff that isn't available on the commercial market. And then we have a goal to kind of build those into our programs into the future. And so, we work with people on whatever level they kind of need us to. So that can be just on like a planning level. We can, help with planting, we can help maintaining, kind of whatever they want our help to do, we can help facilitate that. And even though we do currently charge a fee for installation services and also for materials to cover these costs. But as a nonprofit, we're really striving to think of ways to subsidize that cost for landowners, because we recognize that a huge barrier for getting people to want to take these projects on is not just knowing that they're an option and knowing that it is a positive thing that you can do to increase the ecological function of this region, but it's just straight up the amount that these projects cost. And so we're exploring looking at different writing grants, getting sponsorships, or creating some sort of volunteer reciprocity program to address that financial barrier. And so if anyone has ideas or like leads on sources where we could, leverage our capacity and someone else's money to get these things done, like, please let me know, because I would love to, would love to know what ideas you have. And so I'll kind of quickly go through some of our our current suite of Pocket Prairie installations and those partnerships that we've already formed. So the Dabco apartment complex has really been our pilot program and is one of our keystone projects at this moment. So, for them, this project started because Chris is a little bit of a rebel and lived in one of their apartment complexes for many years and took it upon himself to do some guerrilla gardening. And over time, their facilities people and the apartment owners got interested in what he was doing and why is this crazy guy with a shovel out here on the hillside? And out of that, that boldness from Chris and that earnest interest from Dabco kind of grew this, the idea for the Pocket Prairies project. And so they were really, once they heard about what he was doing and why, were really interested in taking these projects on to increase their visual appeal of places for their residents, but then also to make sure that they were reducing their water inputs and water uses on their sites. So, part of the challenge when somebody has that visual appeal as one of their project goals is getting them to kind of understand the natural cycle of the native plants that we have. And especially if their goal is to use less water, it's not always going to look beautiful all the time. Or well, it does if you recognize what's going on, right? But if you don't know what's going on, it just looks very brown. But if you work with people to educate them, like we have been trying to do at Dabco through the installation of these interpretive panels about the value of these pocket prairies, even in their kind of summer, more dormant state, they're still slowing that rainwater, they're reducing erosion, they're increasing groundwater infiltration, then people can appreciate, what's going on, even if it doesn't look totally green and happy and perfect all year round. And so we have those signs at 4 of our 5 sites. No, you can, yeah, you can go. And so, like I said, we started our first site, by we, I mean Chris, in 2018. And then for a couple of years, that kind of, was the only thing happening. And then finally last spring was when we installed 4 additional Pocket Prairie sites. And so the way that we kind of approached it was in the spring, we had the fortune to be part of some plant relocations that were happening from some land disturbance on Bald Butte. And so we were able to kind of transplant those in some places on our properties and then plant some additional forbs and do some seeding and then kind of maintain and follow up in the fall of 2021 with additional planting and seeding. And then that's also when we installed those interpretive panels. And then going forward in 2022, we're working with DABCO to identify like future areas that can be expanded upon, and we'll continue, you know, maintaining these because they do take, you know, a couple of years worth of time and attention, and then continued maintenance into the future to make sure that they stay on the right track towards the kind of future restoration goals. And so, you know, once people heard that we were taking on these kind of projects, we got another really great opportunity to do something slightly different at the Pullman Recycling Service or Recycling Center in partnership with Pullman Disposal Service. So here, you know, their sites were, or their main concern was reducing fine sediment and runoff in the water that was coming off of the back of the recycling center facility, and then kind of going directly into a municipal storm drain. And so we identified a couple of ways that we could help mitigate that. One, by building kind of water catchment areas at the bottom of the hillside, so that when the water was coming off of that steep slope, before vegetation was able to be established, we would at least be able to kind of capture it and help the sediment settle out, and then provide area for water infiltration. And then you can also see how there's some areas that are just like big and blank and open and like fairly like void of vegetation. And so some of our brave staff and interns kind of scaled all over those hillsides and planted a whole bunch of seeds of different woody shrub species. So hawthorn and chokecherry, to hopefully fill that in. And we'll come back in the springtime and install additional shrubs and grasses and forbs in key areas that we weren't able to do in the fall because we ended up getting like mudded out of the work site. So we'll come back in the spring and help clean that up, and then maintain it and control some invasive species moving into the future. We also this fall were able to start our first private landowner project. So this landowner approached us kind of with the goal to both beautify their property with native plants, and then also, you know, they were really interested in connecting more with the prairie and learning more about it and sharing that information with their neighbors, and really trying to help build like a more of a regional identity around the idea of the Palouse Prairie in like an urban landscape. And so, you know, in this or last fall, we ended up doing some site prep. We pulled up a bunch of plastic landscape material that had been down for who knows how long, and then took a bunch of pine straw out from underneath their one of the areas that they wanted to work on, and then seeded and planted that area with appropriate plants. And then in the spring, we will come back and supplement planting if needed, because I went and checked on it and there has been some deer activity, which is great. We're providing some habitat for wildlife. But I think they may have also pulled out a couple of the plants that we planted. So luckily we have some reserves and yeah, and we'll see how that goes. So in addition to working on the kind of the private and commercial scale, we also have a couple of partnerships with the city that we have been tasked with stewarding. So one of them is in Conservation Park, which is the kind of area that I've drawn a circle around in red. So a natural area here in Pullman was formerly I think a landfill that was then covered and then turned into a nursery, which was then turned into a park. And so it's a very interesting site and a really great opportunity to test a lot of different approaches to highly invaded systems, because about 90% of the plants that are in this area currently are not just non-native, but highly invasive species. So, you know, poison hemlock, all three of the terrible invasive annual grasses, a bunch of skeleton weed, a bunch of white top, like you name it, we got it. So that means we can test different ways of getting rid of it. And so because the neighbors in this area have expressed a very strong concern over the use of herbicides, we're also taking this as an opportunity to think really creatively about non-herbicide methods of control. And so coming up in the spring, we're going to start a really intense like monitoring and kind of baseline survey of this area, install some different trials, trying stuff with mowing, with our goats, solarization. If you have other ideas for me, let me know. I would also love to hear those. and kind of see what works in this sort of like, super harsh, hard environment. And in areas that are not as bad, we've also done some supplemental planting. And so we do have some plants that are established there, but the majority of the site is still highly invaded, and something that we're going to be working very hard on in the future. And I'll also say that we do a lot of heroic weeding because we're able to leverage the labor of a lot of volunteers, which I'm insanely fortunate about, because we couldn't do the work that we do at the scale or in the sites that we do without all of the volunteers that help us. And Alison will talk more about those events, but I just also wanted to express my gratitude for that. And so then the last site that we do a lot of work on is Missouri Flat Creek, which kind of runs through Pullman along Grand Avenue. And this is a project that has had many hands in it. We're just kind of the most recent stewards of this area. The genesis of this project was after a big kind of creek widening in 2011, where it was just kind of bare soil. And then folks from WSU and their, I think, environmental science, like 101 class, lent a really big hand in getting, shrubs and some like riparian areas established with native vegetation. And so our role there really now is to expand the riparian area, kind of moving north on the creek in areas that they weren't able to get to yet. And, keep going with heroic weeding, maintaining that site in a really good way, and then add a lot of diversity in the upland section with native forbs and shrubs. And then again, we're going to be installing some more long-term monitoring to see how we can really like quantify the results of all the efforts of the many, many hands and people that have come in here. And so along with that, we have been doing some trials with our goats, which I think Alison would love to talk more about as well. So I think I will hand off to her now.
Hi there. So mine is not about what different strategies that we're going to be working on for restoration. It's about the community and the effort that helps to accomplish everything that we're doing. So just a little basic overview right now of what we've been doing to source the community's efforts is our CCE events, which are hugely successful by utilizing the platform Give Pulse through WSU and sometimes University of Idaho. I know that when I was working with PCD, we'd have up to like 40 volunteers, and now we have about, we'd have 20 really eager college students looking for some amazing community service hours that also help to complete what we need to be getting done, which is invasive species removal. And the hard work of these people really shows by how much whitetop and of these invasive species have been removed from Missouri Flat Creek and Conservation Park. Not that I don't love college students, but my favorite creatures to remove invasive species are the goats. They're a little bit more lovable. I can pet them, so that's always fun. College students don't like that. So yeah, with that said, goats are a really great mechanism for us to remove invasive species. Not only do they kind of like mimic the natural grazing that some of these areas have experienced in the past, but because they're smaller, rather than using such as like cows, they still help to work with carbon sequestration. They still kind of work the land, but they don't destroy it. And turns out they also aren't a huge fan of bunch grass. So that's great, because at our site in Missouri Flat Creek, they avoided everything. They avoided all the bunch grass and ate a tremendous amount of invasive species. But we went out beforehand to remove the poison hemlock because such as it says, it's poison. So goats are a really great resource to remove invasive species, but they're also a really great way to engage with the community. And I'll speak more to that of how we can engage with community members such as schools on my next slide. But our eco restoration events have been highly successful as well. Those have been about twice a month. We were doing during the planting season, where we would have students come out and either build planter beds, remove invasive species, plant native species as well, and just kind of work the areas that we're in to do the best management that we can. And those were usually held on Saturdays between 9 through 12. So in the future, we'll be having those in the spring too. Weather dependent, I can't give you a definitive date of when that will start. That depends on the rains and how our future weather patterns go. But look for that coming up. That's something that we will be promoting definitely in the future. So if you're interested in an eager person that wants to learn about plants, we have a lot of work for you to get done. And our group education days, that is something that's near and dear to my heart. I'll speak a little bit more about what that entails, but this is where I really want to take a different scale of working with our community and engaging with local school groups and also homeschool groups. So working between K through 12 age and utilizing their imagination along with their dedication to learn about the environment, but at the same time, have them work in these areas that benefit us, but also benefits their minds. And it creates a sense of place for these students to really understand where they're living and why it's important for the work that they're being a part of. Plant Swap was a really fun, different kind of turn of events for us where we weren't removing a species, but we were working to do a fundraising event, but also just kind of allow people to come in, learn about what we are, but at the same time, get some really rad plants. So people, the premise of it was that people came in with house plants that they no longer wanted, and they had the chance to swap out for other plants. So it was a really great win-win where people didn't have to have a great investment. It was a small fee to come in to Paradise Creek Brewery. So shout out to them again for helping us out, have this event outdoors during the time when it was warm. And it was really fun to just see all the different people's questions about what are these plants, how do they want to live, and then also what work do we do. So those are kind of our events that we did for the fall, and coming up, we'll definitely be doing some more repeats. So next slide. And this is where I like to work smarter, not harder. And that's with the Billy Goats, but also collaborating with my group education days. I really feel that having goats as a means for invasive species removal, but also at the same time for students to kind of learn about what livestock is, what their sort of role is inside of these ecosystems, and get a little bit of understanding of why they're a biocontrol and like what is a biocontrol. So you can really sort of have like a different level of understanding and learning from a kindergartner to a 12th grader, right? And you can use these lessons to pertain to what they're doing in school at that moment, whether it be learning about patterns within nature or learning about chlorophyll leaving a leaf or such like that. The picture is kind of turned, but to the right is one of our past group education days that we did with the Palouse Prairie Charter School. And what they're doing there is I asked them to find patterns in nature and see the different types of colored patterns that we could find in leaves, and then discuss why do leaves change color, right? These were second graders, so the idea of chlorophyll might have been borophyll for them, but it was something that we could at least utilize in natural spans, but at the same time, it was integrating our natural systems and education. I learned though, second graders are a little too, they don't have the muscle strength to pull out skeleton weed, but so that's a lesson learned. We just got to get some older students to come out and do that. But they're definitely really excited just to be outdoors in general, especially with the kind of climate that we're dealing with school. So the whole idea is to combine goats with group education, and something I'm super excited about. So if you're a person listening and you have a group of kids that's part of a school or a homeschool group and you're interested, this is where I would really like to tie it in. And these Billy Goat events, our first one that was funded through the Native Plants, the Washington Native Plant Society. And then our second one that was in this past fall was all donation based. So hopefully in the future, we have applied for future grants to be able to fund these events. So we're hoping that this grant pays off in the future so we can keep having these Billy Goats for biodiversity. It's a great community gathering that people can come out during the week or the weekend. The goats are super, super sweet. They let you pet them as long as the fence isn't on electric. But so hopefully in the future we can have these events and we can multifaceted ways for them to be useful. So next slide. And this is kind of where my background is. Place-based education might be a new term for some people that haven't really been too acquainted with education or teaching and such like that. So what is it? Place-based education in the most simplest form is utilizing your natural environment as a tool to teach. So instead of having to buy a bunch of materials and have students have all these different tools to use that are expensive, nature provides in a glorious way. So as long as you have a creative way of developing a lesson plan that pertains to whether it be, snow science or fall or wildlife, it's a really great way for students to be able to engage with their local environment and understand more what's going on. Instead of having them in front of a computer, they're able to go outdoors and experience life through touching and text and tactile ways. To the far left, it's kind of tilted, but I partnered up with the homeschool group where we were working to spread different seeds, and my lesson plan completely went out the door when they realized that they wanted to go down into a ditch. And so we went down into a ditch and we learned about all the things that were down there. And through self-discovery and self-reliance, these students really help to bolster their confidence, but also it makes them learn a little bit more rather than having it just kind of delivered to them in a way that may not be suitable for their minds to learn. So place-based education is really combating certain ways of how people learn. So if you're not a student that just reads a book, if you're more tactile, so it offers for that in a really magnificent way. And to the lower right, whoops, you can see our planter beds there. That's kind of something that I'll talk about in a second, but that is where we built these planter beds, we put in native plants, we have educational signs in front of it. And my goal would always to have school groups to adopt these beds, and they take care of them, they're a steward of them, they learn about so many different facets, soil science, the phenology of plants, weather. So it's so many different things you can utilize. It's just being a little bit creative. So next slide. And this really comes down to shout out to PCD for having us on today. So then this is community collaboration. Without partnering with different community members, we really are going to be spinning our wheels sometimes. And a lot of us, where PCD works more of in a riparian area, sometimes they have a CRP and they're working in the upland areas. We kind of help to file into that gap of areas that may be more of an upland manner, and working smarter, not harder, as again. So adopt a bed program. So we have these at Missouri Flat Creek. If you've walked on the path and you've seen these boxes, that's what they are. If you're interested in wanting to engage with us and develop this box, we are all ready for you to have that be done. And also, I think sometime in the future, it'd be nice to have a platform for nonprofits that are working primarily in conservation, but not always, even city planning, urban planning, such like that. Even people that are working in the higher end, like Department of Ecology, wanting to kind of share their work and support one another so that we just have a better way to adapt to all the changes that are happening in our environment, but also serve the ecosystem the best way that we can. And then once again, our ecosystem volunteer events, those are going to be continuing on throughout the spring. They're super effective at managing our weeds, but also engaging with the community again. And then I think the next slide is done. And here we are, Give Pulse, our website calendar that should be up pretty soon. Facebook and Instagram are the means that you can find out about our events. We also have, we also do monthly mailing out on the emails, so you can find out about that. If you really are interested in doing a group education day, that's who you contact is me. And same thing with volunteering. We can also just do specialized events if you're not a school, if you're just like a group of people that want to get outdoors, we can organize something for you too. And that is it for me.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Sarah and Allison and everybody out there in participant land for tolerating the strange rotations. I'm not sure why PowerPoint decided that was the thing to do, but oh well. So to close things up, I wanted to give people kind of a quick preview. I keep referencing how exciting our 2022 is. We have some giant projects that we've been talking about for a long time, and they're finally being able to move forward in 2022. And so some of the ones that I'm the most excited about coming down the pipeline, which I'm only going to give a teaser today, so sorry. Partly because I could talk about this stuff forever, as anybody who has ever talked to me about it can attest. One of the major ones that we're really excited about is Palouse biochar. So we've talked a bit about the removal of all these invasive species, and then so an obvious question is, well, where do all these weeds go? If you're not familiar with biochar, it is one of these things. I'm going to borrow the words of a webinar that we watched recently, where it just seems too good to be true. essentially, it is a conversion into a very stable carbon isotope that can remain in soils for somewhere between hundreds to thousands of years. It improves soil, retains water, sequesters carbon, filters runoff, slices, dices, walks your dog for, no, I'm just kidding. But it does a lot of really amazing things. And one thing that's really cool about it is it tends to be fairly open to having a lot of waste biomass, including weeds, brush, invasive species, yard waste, and other woody biomasses into biochar. And it can be used in active farmland. So it is a wild sort of thing. And then that was something that appeared briefly on one of Sarah's slides about our work at Conservation Park, is exploring nucleation. So the idea of, instead of planting evenly spaced things in a long wide row, really clumping things up. In other words, making very, very dense islands or very dense plantations, also referred to as nuclei. And that is actually one of the benefits of having project sites that are so distant and disparate, is that is an adaptation of a fairly new but rapidly gaining popularity technique for restoring rainforests, and one that we use in Madagascar, being transferred back to the prairie. And it seems to have a lot of the very, very cool benefits. And the last one that's not on here, because as I said, this was focused on Palouse Prairie. But one of the cool things that we've done, that a pepper that we have that I mentioned, is actually becoming available for the first time. So check out our website for a monthly donor fundraiser that we're doing to get your hands on some of the pepper and to support projects not only in Madagascar, but in the Great Plains and right here on the Palouse. And so with that, I will flounder for a little while before I advance the slide and direct people to where they can find out more. If you'd like to kind of find our central hub, it's phoenixconservancy.org. The website is undergoing a major revamp, so pardon our dust, but that's a good starting point and has a lot of really cool resources, more information about what we do. If you want to talk to somebody about Palouse Prairie, Sarah knows an enormous amount, as I'm sure came across there, about all the native plants and about Palouse Prairie in general. She can be reached at shill@phoenixconservancy.com, or that should be, sorry, org. And Palouse at phoenixconservancy.org. If you have questions, as Alison said, about education, outreach, volunteering, and maybe just goats, because they're a lot of fun. Alison's the person to talk to. She was A. Crowley at Phoenix Conservancy, and again, that should be .org, not .com, sorry about that, or volunteer at phoenixconservancy.org. And if you have any other questions outside of that, feel free to drop me a line at any time. I love chatting with people, and we'd love to hear from you. And I'm at cduke@phoenixconservancy.org, or mail at phoenixconservancy.org. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for listening.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris, Sarah, and Alison. That was wonderful. So great to hear all the work you guys are doing, and yeah, super inspiring. So fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that tonight. You will all be getting their email addresses later tonight in an email. So just if you do have more questions, you can ask them directly. But in the meantime, we did get a lot of engagement in the chat. So we do have a few more minutes. We could answer a few questions if you guys are feeling up for it. So one question that came in, how is climate change likely to affect restored Palouse Prairie? Sarah, do you want to take this one on?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? The predictions are that, you know, in this area, we will be getting the same approximate amount of rain, but the timing or water, but the timing of when it comes is going to shift. So very likely, you know, we'll be having wetter winters and drier springs and summers. So that tells me that, you know, plants that really require that moist early spring conditions, and maybe a lot of the freeze thaw cycles or some temperature regulation to get their germination on, like might, you know, they might not be as well adapted. Whereas the prairie has also a lot of species that are really tolerant of a wide range of conditions. What makes the Palouse Prairie really unique is the combination of the plant community plus the topography, plus the soils. And so if you look specifically just at the plant communities, a lot of the ones that we find in the prairie can be found, over to the west where it's a little bit drier into the channeled scablands, or they can be found, more up in, moister forest areas. So I think that the plant species that we have, for the most part, are fairly adaptable to a wide range of conditions. We probably will lose some specialists that need, really specific temperature and moisture regimes. But I do feel hopeful that there is enough diversity, like functional and floral diversity, that something will persist, right? Like these environments have always changed. They're just changing really fast now. And we're just going to do our best to ensure that there is enough genetic diversity in whatever populations we're assembling, that hopefully they have what it takes to win out and be successful in the future. And, hopefully we'll learn more about what the state of things will be in the future, and we can make more calculated predictions and be more intentional about, maybe where we're moving plant materials from and to. But for now, we just kind of shotgun blast a wide range of genetics and hope that there's enough diversity in there that the right thing will persist.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, the adaptability game. Craig had asked a question in here about who provides the goats for the restoration project. Al, do you want to take that?
Oh, go ahead. Well, we all know him. It's Les and Shay Campbell from up in Lachey Goat Rentals, and herding services are provided by probably one of the most amazing dogs I think I've ever met, named Hank. It's a border collie, and they move them from pen to pen with Hank, so they just turn him loose and he knows what to do. But that's Lachey Goat Rentals up in Cheney, and we do have and have talked to some other areas. There's a number of places in our area that do have goat teams. It worked out the best with Cheney, and we just absolutely love Les and Shay. So that's who we use for the time being, but we're hoping we get to extend more opportunities in the future to more local goat teams.
Nice. Awesome.
Yeah, if you have questions about breeds and such like that, you can contact me.
Do you guys have plans to host another event this spring with the goats?
Hopefully. I think a lot of it's dependent on some of the grant funding that we've been applying for, but we're pretty optimistic. Chris might be able to speak a little bit more to it.
Yeah, so we've put in for funding from a number of different sources for hopefully as many as 3. As Alison mentioned, the one that we did in this fall was funded entirely by private donations, so that's always an option. We have a small sign up in Conservation Park saying we miss our goats, and we really do, because they are just so much fun. A lot more fun than a lawnmower. So as many as 3, potentially more. But as Sarah alluded to, it's going to be a bit dependent on when the rains come and kind of the ideal time to really hammer the weeds that we're trying to knock back. We tend to time these events around specific cycles when the seeds are about to be ripe, especially on some species where if you graze them too early and they haven't produced seeds yet, they might just go back for another run the next year. Whereas if you let them seed, they'll often die out. So it depends on the timing of what's going to happen. But from a funding angle, it kind of depends on the community and grant ability. The short answer is as many as we can, because it's just great. I don't know what it is, but the charisma of a team of goats is just endlessly. It's like watching the ocean. Very
Nice. That's awesome. I like that analogy. We did get a lot of questions that came in beforehand, and for time's sake, we probably won't get a chance to get to all of them. So if you had a question that was specific to Sarah, Chris, or Allison, we will be including their email addresses, and you can email them directly to find out more information. A lot of great engagement here. So thank you so much for your guys' time. And one funding opportunity that I just wanted to make mention of that somebody had mentioned in the chat was the Conservation Reserve Program through NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And they encourage farmers to convert highly erodible lands into vegetative cover. And that's a funding opportunity that would be available to farmers and ranchers. So maybe there'd be a good conversation, Sarah, we could talk about and ways to work with landowners to